Good evening, class, and welcome to the first topic of our first module in this course on the federal government of the United States. Today, we are going to embark on a journey that is not just about memorizing dates or names of old documents, but about understanding the very DNA of the political reality you live in every single day. Whether you are driving down I-95 here in Miami, dealing with a zoning issue in Coral Gables, or watching the news about a showdown in Washington, D.C., you are witnessing the machinery that we are going to dismantle and analyze today. We are going to explore the historical origins of the American political system. Now, before we dive into the specific events, I want to challenge a common misconception. Many people think of the American government as a machine that was built in a single moment, like a car rolling off an assembly line in 1787, perfect and finished. But that is not accurate. From an analytical perspective, the American system should not be understood as a finished product, but as a historically constructed institutional order. It is the result of learning, of deep conflicts, and of compromises that have been sedimented in constitutional norms and lasting political practices over centuries. Think of it more like the skyline of Miami. It wasn't built all at once. It has layers, history, old structures supporting new ones, and it is constantly being renovated. This system is shaped by a complex and gradual historical process where philosophical traditions, colonial practices of self-government, and intense debates about power all converged. This convergence resulted in a political order oriented toward balancing authority and freedom, structuring the government through stable constitutional rules. Let's travel back to the 17th and 18th centuries. The American political system did not emerge from the abstract application of a political theory, like a scientist mixing chemicals in a lab, but from a long-standing institutional practice within the British colonial context. This is what we call the colonial matrix. Between the 17th and 18th centuries, the colonies developed governmental arrangements that, while legally subordinate to the British Crown, normalized the idea that authority should be exercised through rules, representative assemblies, and legal procedures. This is crucial. Long before the Declaration of Independence, Americans were already governing themselves. This experience generated what can be defined as a political culture of self-government, understood as the set of values, expectations, and practices that guide the relationship between citizens and political authority. To make this concrete, think about the early history of South Miami or even the very first town meetings in New England. In these colonial assemblies and town meetings, two lasting principles were consolidated. First, that political representation is a fundamental right, and second, a deep-seated distrust of distant authority, which was initially the metropolitan government in London and later became the federal government in Washington. These colonial continuities explain why American constitutionalism relies so heavily on deliberative procedures and institutional controls even after independence. When you see a local community board in Miami-Dade fiercely debating a new ordinance, refusing to just accept a mandate from the county or the state, you are seeing that ancient colonial DNA at work, that culture of self-government where local knowledge challenges distant power. Now, while these practices were forming on the ground, the intellectual software of the revolution was being written by philosophers. The political ideology of American independence draws on European intellectual traditions, but reinterpreted in the light of the American experience. The most famous name here is John Locke. Locke occupies a central place by providing a liberal theory of political power based on three fundamental concepts that you must know: natural rights, the consent of the governed, and the social contract. Natural rights are those rights inherent to individuals, existing prior to the state. They are yours simply because you are human. Consent of the governed means that political legitimacy comes only from the people's acceptance, and the social contract is the agreement by which individuals delegate power to a government specifically to protect those rights. In the American context, Locke wasn't just a textbook author, he functioned as a shared political language. This allowed the colonists to present their break with the British Crown not as a chaotic rebellion, but as a defense of legitimacy. They weren't breaking the law, they were enforcing the contract that the king had broken. But Locke wasn't the only influence. This liberal tradition was complemented by a heritage of republicanism. Now, be careful here. I don't mean the Republican Party of today. I mean republicanism as a political philosophy characterized by a concern about the corruption of power, the need for civic virtue, and a fear of the concentration of authority. The result of mixing Lockean liberalism and republicanism is a constitutive tension that still exists today, a tension between the protection of individual rights, liberalism, and the institutional control of power, republicanism. This tension explains the centrality of institutional design in the American system, particularly the separation of powers and checks and balances. After declaring independence, the former colonies faced a massive practical challenge, transforming a revolutionary alliance into a functional political order. Their first attempt was the Articles of Confederation in 1781. I want you to look at the Articles of Confederation not just as a failure, but as a logical reaction to their trauma with the British king. The Articles established a deliberately weak national government. It had a unicameral Congress, meaning just one house, and essentially no strong executive branch. It had limited fiscal and coercive capacity, meaning it couldn't effectively tax or force states to do anything. From an analytical perspective, the Articles were an experiment in predominant state sovereignty, but this quickly revealed practical limitations. Imagine if Florida, Georgia, and Alabama all had their own currencies and trade wars today. It would be economic chaos. Under the Articles, the inability to collect taxes, regulate trade, or respond to crises demonstrated that an excessively weak state can also jeopardize rights, stability, and prosperity. This was a harsh historical lesson. It was crucial in justifying the need for a more robust federal government without abandoning the commitment to freedom. The chaos under the Articles is what drove the founders to Philadelphia. This brings us to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. This convention can be understood as an exercise in institutional engineering aimed at resolving the problems identified under the Articles without reproducing the abuses of centralized power. They had to thread the needle, strong enough to govern, but not strong enough to tyrannize. The resulting constitution is not only a declaration of principles, but an operating system of political power. It defined listed competencies, created bicameralism, two houses of Congress, established an independent executive, and a judicial power with interpretative authority. Two key mechanisms defined this new operating system. First, the separation of powers, which is the distribution of governmental functions among different branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, to prevent the concentration of power. Second, checks and balances, which complement the separation by allowing each branch to limit the others. In the context of the American political system, checks and balances refer to the set of institutional mechanisms through which each branch of the federal government can limit, supervise, or influence the actions of the others to avoid excessive concentration of power and preserve constitutional balance. But do not think for a second that everyone agreed on this new plan. The proposal of the Constitution sparked a fierce debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. This dispute revolved around one central question: where does the greatest danger to freedom lie? The Federalists feared fragmentation and state impotence. They remembered the chaos of the Articles of Confederation. The Anti-Federalists, however, warned about centralization and the distance between rulers and the ruled. They looked at this new central government and saw the potential for a new tyranny. This conflict is fascinating because it didn't just end, it became institutionalized in the system. We see it in the structure of federalism, defined as the constitutional division of powers between the national government and the states. We see it in the territorial representation in the Senate, where small states have equal power to large ones. And we see it in the subsequent adoption of the Bill of Rights, which was essentially a concession to the Anti-Federalists to guarantee individual protections. You can see this tension playing out right here in Florida today. Think about the debates we often see between the government in Tallahassee or local leaders in Miami against the mandates coming from Washington, D.C. Whether the topic is environmental regulation, healthcare policy, or education standards, the core argument echoes the federalists and anti-federalists. Is it better to have a uniform national standard, federalist view, or should local communities decide for themselves, anti-federalist view? This tension continues to structure contemporary debates about the scope of federal government and state autonomy. Finally, to truly understand the American system, we must look beyond the legal documents to the culture that sustains them. For this, we turn to Alexis de Tocqueville, a French observer who provides an indispensable socio-political reading of the system. Tocqueville didn't just look at the laws, he looked at the habits of the people. His analysis of associationism, the tendency of Americans to organize voluntarily into intermediary bodies, religious groups, civic clubs, and political organizations, reveals that American democracy is not expressed only in elections, it is sustained by civic habits. Tocqueville defined these habits as social practices that foster participation, deliberation, and the peaceful resolution of conflict. In Miami, we see this vibrancy in our diverse community organizations, from neighborhood associations in Little Havana to environmental groups protecting Biscayne Bay. These aren't government agencies, they are citizens coming together to solve problems. Tocqueville argued that these associations are the schools of democracy. However, he also warned of risks such as the tyranny of the majority and social conformity, which remain relevant for analyzing current phenomena such as political polarization. So, as we conclude this first lecture, remember, the American government is a historical construct born from the colonial matrix of self-government shaped by the philosophy of Locke and republicanism forged in the failure of the Articles of Confederation and designed in 1787 to balance power through conflict. It is a system that demands your participation, just as Tocqueville observed. In our next session, we will dig deeper into the specific powers of the Constitution. Thank you.